All right, good afternoon. Good afternoon to everyone. I hope you're having a lovely day today. It's a great day, Thursday, Throwback Thursday. So, just reflecting on how the whole week is going. One of the rules that has been difficult for me to keep is not touching my face because it's very hot. But yeah, please remember to wash your hands and to stay at home if you can, and social distancing, observe your social distance, and try and keep the rules that have been stipulated for us throughout this COVID period. I'm sure that we all, as a world, will be able to overcome this as soon as we are on track with observing all the rules that have been stipulated for us. Okay? So, today's class, we will be continuing from where we left off yesterday. And in our vein to do that, we will also try and divert or to add on to the knowledge that we already established yesterday. And yesterday we started with dealing with the environment and to understand how our interactions with the environment reflect on the environment itself, and even on ourselves and on our societies and communities as human beings. So today, having established that the environment is affected in certain ways, Professor Mchombusa, thank you so much for joining us. Having established that the environment is affected in so many ways by human behavior, and that conflict does result from the abundance or the scarcity even of environmental resources and natural resources, we therefore want to establish what we can term as environmental security. Now, in our efforts to establish environmental security, we will also look at indigenous knowledge systems, okay? Because I think it is very important for us to tie the two to understand that environmental security as a whole operates in a space where indigenous knowledge systems also function. In addition to establishing indigenous knowledge systems and how they impact our ability to manage our environment as human beings, we will also look at indigenous conflict resolution mechanisms. Okay? So we'll try and get back to the roots. How does our environment affect the way we behave as human beings? Okay? As well as how do methods that are known to local communities and indigenous peoples help us resolve conflicts that may result as that may take place as a result of environmental differences that we may have. Okay, so we'll engage in that today. The blanket theme for starting from yesterday has been environmental security, and we've been trying to establish how environmental security plays a role in impacting our livelihoods as human beings. So today we bring in these elements. We bring in issues of indigenous knowledge systems. Okay, Uncle Milambo, thank you so much for coming through. Wow, Papa, it's great to have you here. Indigenous knowledge systems. So indigenous knowledge systems are their concepts. These are ways of life. These are ways in which local peoples live. And the reasons these systems have existed for so long and continue to exist up to now is because they are functional and they are workable and they are sustainable. And we have situations where these knowledge systems have been adapted and made Western, and we have situations where these knowledge systems are sometimes looked down upon. But we're going to try today and break down all these intricacies, okay? How do we protect indigenous people, flora and fauna? How does flora and fauna help protect us in the modern day? We have the example of Madagascar that has discovered what they're claiming to be a sort of cure for coronavirus. And it's coming out of indigenous flora and fauna. It's coming out of medicines that are native to that land. And you realize that the majority of the medicines that we use are actually as a result of indigenous flora and fauna. So just going to go right into it. We'll try and keep the concept, I'll try and do this in two parts and as short as possible. We will look at environmental security and indigenous knowledge systems in one part as fast as possible. And then towards the end, we will try then to do a case study and to see how indigenous practices can then result and aid in conflict resolution. Okay? How can we use indigenous systems to end conflict, to prevent conflict? Is it every conflict that requires the intervention of the United Nations? Is it every conflict that requires the methods that have been stipulated at international level? Can it be that there are certain conflicts, say differences between communities over cattle and grazing land, that can be settled through indigenous methods? And we'll go deeper into it, but just to give you a synopsis of where we are going with this, we look at the Rwanda massacre that took place, okay, and the genocide. And following the genocide and the establishment of a new government, they needed methods and ways in which they could resolve the peace. The normal Western justice system is about retribution. It's about you are wrong and you must be punished. But the nature of hate that the society was going through could not have a system that would punish completely everyone. It needed a system that would somehow accept the new fate, okay, and then accept even people that had offended previously and still find a way to move into the future and forge ahead with each other. And that's how we see something known as gachacha coming up, a system, an indigenous system of justice. So that's the direction we are going. We will try and pitch modern methods, or rather Western methods, with indigenous or native methods. Okay, so let's get into it straight away. So indigenous peoples, you've probably heard of the phrase indigenous peoples. These are defined in national or international legislation as having a set of rights. They are entitled to a set of rights by being indigenous peoples, and it's often based on their historical ties to a particular territory. The Khoisan in Southern Africa, the Red Indians in the United States, and in Australia, you also have the Aborigines there. So these are groups that have a certain history to the territory that they inhabit, and their cultural or historical distinctiveness from other populations who in most cases are politically dominant. This is often what happens, that indigenous societies are often less dominant than, that is politically, they are less politically dominant than other groups in the society that oftentimes come and join them there. And I think this is the reality in most cases. In the examples that we've given, we are yet to see a Khoisan president in Southern Africa, and yet they are believed to have been the first settlers in the area. We are yet to see a Red Indian president in the United States of America, and yet they are believed to be the first settlers. The Aborigines is the same situation. And many other countries where you have first settlers often maybe not disadvantaged, but they are less advantaged politically. You find settler groups come and tend to overhaul the political systems and take over from those that are actually entitled to the political systems that exist. So according to the United Nations, indigenous communities and peoples and nations are those which having a historical continuity with pre-invasion and pre-colonial societies that developed on their territories, consider themselves to be distinct from those societies now dominant in those parts of the world. So these are peoples that have existed pre-colonialism and pre-invasion. So they must have been in that land before white settlers came and the colonial system, which lasted about 100 years. So it must be before that for you to qualify as an indigenous people. Also, indigenous peoples, or first peoples, as they are sometimes called, they include, as I've mentioned, the Autochthonous peoples or ethnic groups who are descended or identify with certain inhabitants of a given territory. The UN Declaration on Rights of Indigenous People, it acknowledges that human rights of indigenous peoples against cultural discrimination, and it also seeks to promote respect as well as harmonious relations between the indigenous peoples and the states. This is particularly important, and it came into cognizance because it was realized that in most cases, indigenous communities are not guaranteed the rights and the way of life that they initially used to practice. The Swahili people in the Kenya, the Maasai people rather, in the Kenya areas and somewhere there, in Tanzania and the East African region, had certain practices that included hunting of animals, wildlife. Now, with time, this has become an offense, a state and government, an international recognized offense. So, how then, where do we place them? In a apparently modern society where they do not completely fit in. So where do we place them in such a society? So it is estimated that there are about 370 to 400 million indigenous peoples spread over 70 countries worldwide. So most likely the country that you and I are from, I have people watching here from currently just over 6 countries. I can see the Namibians here, the Zambians here, the Angolans, and the South Africans here. See someone from the UK watching, and all of us are from different countries and different parts of the world, and we can tell that in each of these areas, it is highly likely that there are certain people that were there, existed prior to colonialization and prior to settlement, and these are the people that identify as the indigenous peoples of these societies that we live in. So according to the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, these are the following factors that identify indigenous people. So if you want to classify yourselves as indigenous people, these are the following factors that you have to look into. So self-identification, first of all, you must identify as indigenous peoples at an individual level, and it must be accepted by the community. And you must be also as an individual accepted in the community also as a member of that community. So there must be historical continuity. Just like I said, it must be pre-colonial and pre-settler. So it's societies that have existed for long periods of time. There must be strong links to local territories and natural resources. Oftentimes, the distinction and major distinctions that we have with indigenous communities is that they are able to manipulate the local and resources, the natural resources that exist within a society to sustain their livelihood. This is, they are able to obtain medicines from trees and roots and things of that sort. They are able to obtain food from bushes and to know what seasons to operate in and what times to apply certain techniques. And they're able to know when to hunt what animals, when fishing is not properly viable and things like that. You must have a strong link to your territory and to your natural resources. You cannot be considering yourself an indigenous individual or society or community if you are not even able to feed off the land that you live in. You must be able to have certain connections to the natural resources within your territory, to the other forms of resources that exist in your land, such as to ensure that you provide yourselves, independent of the state, with certain medical provisions. You must be able to have healings and whatnot through tree barks and through roots and through such things. You must be able to use local resources, natural resources. So there has to be also distinct socio-economic or political systems. And there has to be, for instance, socio-economic and political systems would include things like your ability as a society to inherit royalty, for instance. In a modern state, leadership is taken through democratic, at least in the preferred system, there are democratic methods and processes that you have to go into. But in an indigenous society, there are certain traditional systems that allow for matrimonial, patrimonial, and things like that. And these are well defined to say maybe the son of your sister is the one who takes over from you. If you are, say for instance, a leader in a community, the only person who takes over from you is the son of your sister, or it's only a woman's child who can be ascertained as being the true bloodline, things like that. So all these are systems that exist. So they also have to be a distinct language. You have to speak a language that is distinct, and a culture also. Okay, you have to also have non-dominant groups of society. Okay, they also must be resolved to maintain and reproduce their ancestral environments, as well as peoples and communities. So this should be a greater aim of your society, to continuously reproduce yourselves so as to maintain the wealth of the culture. I think we can ask ourselves what communities we think would fit into those descriptions that we've given, and how do those communities fit in to a modern world that we're living in right now. Okay, so there's also a certain group known as local communities. These are a bit different from indigenous communities, but they're often used interchangeably and together, coherently also. So a local community is a group of interacting people sharing an environment. A group of interacting people sharing an environment. In human communities, intent, beliefs, resources, preferences, needs, risks, and a number of other conditions may be present and common, affecting the identity of participants and their degree of cohesiveness. A community is considered a local community, or as a group of interacting people sharing an environment. Okay? The moment you have a group of interacting individuals sharing a certain environment, they can be termed to be a community. In human communities, oftentimes, intent is the same, beliefs are the same, the resources that we use are the same, we have the same preferences, our needs are often the same, the risks that we incur are often the same, and a number of other conditions are present and common among us that affect the way we live as human beings, if we are to be termed as a community. So this is a social unit, okay, as in a group of people living in the same area. That you have to take note. The geography of the concept community is very significant. It must be geographically distinguishable, okay. So community members ideally do not claim exclusive identity or originality, because the only thing that they often enjoy are the same rights and the same privileges, but they can't completely say, I'm only this. No. They often exist with other associations, but they do belong to that community. Okay? The United Nations describes a local community as being the human population in a distinct ecological area who depend directly on its biodiversity and ecosystem goods and services for all or part of their livelihood, and who have developed or acquired traditional knowledge as a result of this dependency. So this includes farmers, fisher folk, pastoralists, forest dwellers, and other communities of the like. Okay? So a community can be, or rather a local community can be a group of people living in the same place or sharing particular characteristics. Recently, I had the privilege and the honor of leading an association and being part of it. I joined this as a young student, and at the time I remember I was an ordinary member, and then became Secretary General, and then later on became Vice President, and eventually towards my last year of university I became President of what was then the Association of Students in Zambian Students in Namibia, okay, the Association of Zambian Students in Namibia. So this association affiliates itself as a community, okay? It's a community of Zambian students living in Namibia. The issues that we face are the same. The challenges that we faced are the same. The victories that we incurred are the same. And there are many such issues, okay? So, for instance, when immigration laws were made a bit stiffer to include insurance and medical certificates and all that, it affected all of us as a community. And those of us who were privileged to be in leadership at the time had to look out for the affairs of the community as a whole. When management of the institutions around, and because this association did quite cater for institutions including the University of Namibia, the National University of Science and Technology, which was at the time the Polytechnic University of Namibia, and several other campuses around the country in Namibia that had Zambian students. Okay, so when issues such as examinations, students who were owing the institutions were barred from taking part in examinations, those are things that affected all of us, because the majority of us did come from homes where we did not completely have the capacity. And so being in university itself was a privilege, but we were not able completely to meet some of the requirements when it comes to financial grounds. So it was a community. So everyone can relate. When it comes to issues of accommodation, everyone can relate. Issues of lack of pocket money or things of that sort, and being robbed or being in hospital, being sick. These are things that the greater group as a community can relate to. So we are, in that case, a community of Zambian students in Namibia, okay? And you can identify yourself also. You have several communities in which you are found in, whether it's your neighborhood or whether it's your religious affiliations and the impacts they have on your way of living. Do you have a geographical distinction around defining that which you are? Okay? So you can engage in that discussion. Try and find out for yourself, what communities do I affiliate to? Excuse me. So indigenous peoples and local communities as a phrase came about from the Convention on Biological Diversity in 1992, and also in the Nagoya Protocol on access to genetic resources and fair, equitable sharing of the benefits arising from the utilization to the Convention on Biological Diversity. This was signed in 2010. Okay, so this one, it uses the term indigenous and local communities in recognition of communities that have long association with the lands and the waters that they have traditionally lived on or used. Okay, so we move into fauna and flora. So flora is the life, the plant life, occurring in a particular region or time. This is generally the naturally occurring or indigenous native plant life. Okay, that is what flora and fauna is. Flora rather, is the plant life. Okay, so flora comes off as plant life. Fauna is animal life. Okay, so I know sometimes it's very difficult to distinguish between the two, between the flora and the fauna. However, the flora is plant life, the fauna is animal life. Both of them being life that exists in a particular region or time, and generally the naturally occurring or indigenous native substance that is found in a place that can be described as flora and fauna. So one word that cannot be separated from the phrase flora and fauna is indigenous. We cannot look at flora or fauna or both of them together without associating them to the phrase indigenous. So how do you protect indigenous people and local communities? So indigenous people and local communities often exercise rights and control over valuable natural resources. In most cases, those interested in those valuable resources are powerful individuals, organizations, and even countries. Yesterday, we said that one of the conundrums that come about with natural resources is that those who own them, those who process them, those who control them, and those who are able to exchange them for something worthwhile are often different groups. So you have one group, maybe being the local community, that owns the resources and the land, okay, the chief that owns the land. Then you have another group being an investor that owns the ability to mine. And then you have another group, international organization or multinational corporation, that has the ability to trade maybe this copper or this gold at the London Stock Exchange, at the Johannesburg Stock Market or Metal Exchange Market, or things like that. So each and every stage has a different stakeholder. So in this case, the most basic stakeholder that we need to look at and to understand is the local community. The local community is the most fundamental owner of the natural resource. it is impossible to have access to natural resources without the acceptance of local communities. As a matter of fact, many international organizations and multinational corporations and transnational corporations also have had serious challenges with accessing certain resources in areas where they are extremely abundant, simply because local communities did not accept them or receive them. Resistance from local communities can breed conflict. Can not only breed conflict, can lead to lack of access and inability to capitalize on the available resources. So if local communities are not willing to surrender the land in which you intend to mine your copper, your cobalt, or whatever else, it becomes impossible for you to access these things. So you need the cooperation of the local communities, and so the first way in which we can ascertain this cooperation is by acknowledging that they exercise the rights and control over the valuable natural resources. Okay, so therefore the danger of these communities to be overexploited exists, and there is also a need to ensure that their interests are safeguarded and protected, because these are local communities, in most times indigenous peoples without wealth, without much resources, dealing with institutions and corporations that are extremely wealthy, multi-million-dollar accounts. It becomes difficult. As such, you find that they are made to sign certain agreements that may not be in their favor. They are made to agree to certain concessions that do not favor them, that do not work completely to their advantage. So local communities must be protected from multinational corporations and exploitations by the rich and powerful and those who actually want to have access to these resources. So the communities may also lack the capacity to negotiate these agreements, and in most cases they're exploited and they're manipulated, because all exchanges when it comes to trade in the international space, as well as with regards to land for mining and for fishing and for other exclusive activities, they are made through agreements. Okay, there are certain agreements that must be put in place, and for these agreements to be solidified, it takes paperwork and signing of contracts and things like that. And most of the times, local communities do not have the capacity to engage. They may not be able to read as well. They may not be able to understand terms and conditions, because even some of us here who are in urban areas we are most times exploited and unable to understand terms and conditions, even simply from just banks. So what more now when you're dealing with local communities who are, in most cases, only have access to basic education and most of the times do not engage in languages that are used at international level, such as English and French. They are oftentimes engaging in their local languages. So they are more prone and more susceptible to being exploited. So in fact, in most cases, these indigenous peoples and local communities have even been totally ignored, sidelined, and displaced from their territories to pave way for development. So this concept called development that we will engage in more in coming classes, God willing, it has come with certain disadvantages and advantages on the flora, on the fauna, and on the local communities and peoples. If today they were to discover oil on the land that you occupy currently, it is highly likely that you will be displaced and moved to somewhere else to start a new life, or compensated in one way or another, just so that these minerals and these resources can be accessed. And this has come up as an issue. It's an environmental issue, it's an indigenous activist issue, it's a human rights issue. There are many sectors of society that have said there's a lot of exploitation that goes on when it comes to local communities, and sometimes they are simply just ignored. A company will just come in with earth-moving machines and equipment and begin to operate, and the communities that live in those communities are left wondering to say, what's going on? What's our compensation for the land that we've lost, agricultural land, the arable land, and things like that. So sometimes they're just sidelined, and sometimes they're displaced. Daily and day in and day out, the Ministry of Lands and Natural Resources is dealing with issues of members of the community being displaced to pave way for developmental activities. And so these are issues that come into play. To what extent is this moral? Is this correct? How can we rectify? How can we aid these societies that are finding themselves in these situations? So there's what is known as prior informed consent, one way in which we can protect these communities, our communities. Prior informed consent, okay? A right or a principle of prior informed consent is sometimes known as a free, prior, and informed consent, okay? FPIC or PIC. This is referred to or implied in several international instruments. When you read various documents about indigenous peoples and their interactions with the environment, and with development also, you come across this phrase, prior informed consent, or free, prior, and informed consent. Okay, you will come across this phrase. So it's very, when it comes to the environmental sector, okay, if we isolate it to the environmental sector, you have Article 6, Section 4 of the Basel Convention on the Transboundary Movement of Hazardous Wastes. This was established in 1989, as well as the Convention on Biological Diversity in 1992. So both of these speak loudly and to the affairs of indigenous peoples to say they must be free, prior, and informed consent. So the term flows from the implementation of the general principle of participation of indigenous peoples in decision making, involvement in the formulation, implementation, and evaluation of programs affecting them. When you read Article 32, Section 2, it shows us that the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, it brings out this element to say it's important that human beings who live in a community must be consulted as and when outsiders seek to bring development or to create certain changes to the society in which they live or which they have occupied. Okay? The purpose of the use of the adjective free in the second pairing, because initially it was just known as prior informed consent, but with time it has gone on to be termed free, prior, and informed consent. Okay, so this is to ensure that no co-option or manipulation is used in the course of negotiations. Okay, while inclusion of the term prior acknowledges that the importance of allowing time to indigenous communities to fully understand the proposals respecting the time required for achieving consensus. Okay, so this is very important. First of all, you cannot co-opt communities into accepting your requests. They must be free and willing, and they must be able to accept your offer. When you present them with an offer, they must be able to say, okay, fine, we accept your offer, or no, we don't accept your offer, I would like to stay here. Because some communities have certain things that are very attached to them. For instance, graveyards and other spiritually notable issues that relate to where they have buried their ancestors, okay? Certain lands that exist and that they've lived in for so many years. And communities may come and try to dispel them from these environments and these societies. They should be able to have a say, okay? So the notion of informed consent reflects the growing acceptance that the environment and social impact assessment are a prerequisite for any negotiation. Okay, so before any negotiation goes into displacement or relocation or development in areas where there are indigenous peoples, there must be an environmental and social impact assessment taken by the relevant authorities. In addition to that, the members of that society must consent. They must say, we agree and we are fine with moving, and we're fine, you guys can come through and develop, and you can break our graveyards and you can break our whatnot. Without that, it becomes wrong and illegal for you to do this. So there are certain terms and certain articles that have legally bound the international community, to which I can see, just like I said, a diverse viewership of people from different countries. Most of these countries have ratified these agreements. For instance, there is the Convention on Biological Diversity of 1992, Article 18 also of the Nagoya Protocol on access to genetic resources and fair equitable sharing of benefits arising from the utilization of the Convention of Biological Diversity signed in 2010. Also, there are many others, but especially the Convention on Biological Diversity. It's a very significant document, and it alludes a lot to issues to do with indigenous communities and how they should be safe and they should be protected from invasion, from co-option, and from other such practices that threaten their livelihoods. Okay, so protection. What then can we determine as being protection of these communities, as well as of flora and fauna? How can we protect our flora and fauna? How can Madagascar ensure that the plant that they have used in finding the cure for the coronavirus does not become commercialized outside of the patent that they have established as a country? It must be protected. The people of Madagascar should be the ones to benefit financially and economically and in other ways from the proceeds that come from selling of that natural resource. Okay, so how can we ensure protection? So protection has tended to refer to protection of traditional knowledge and the traditional culture expressions against some form of unauthorized use by third parties. This means, therefore, that it is the ideas that we use, the ways in which, I know some of us have been exposed to a period in time when if you are sick, you have a fever or whatnot, they just put a mbaula somewhere there, a brazier, and they put some roots inside there, boil that stuff, cover you with a blanket, and it should be able to cure you. Within no time, you're good to go. Those are indigenous systems and practices and cultural practices, and that has been westernized. There are Western ways of doing that ensure that you receive healing through that. There are certain plants that have been acknowledged and recognized to say when you take them in a certain way, when you boil them and drink the stuff that comes out of that, when you chew them, when you brush with them, or whatever it is, they do have certain healing particles in them and elements, and they do have such potency. So how can we protect our societies from exploitation? There are certain plants that exist only in certain places of the world. I'm aware that cobalt is very rare actually, and yet it exists in abundance in the Congo. And cobalt is a vital element in the development of our mobile phones and our laptops and our lithium batteries and things like that. All these technological devices often use certain measures of cobalt. So to what extent can the Congolese people protect their natural resource, and can they be able to benefit from the existence and availability of cobalt in their country? Okay. Also, there are two ways in which we can classify this form of protection. So there's positive protection. So these are two aspects of positive protection of traditional knowledge and traditional culture. These are expressions by intellectual property rights. Okay, you can obtain intellectual property rights. There's a debate currently going on over Shimumbi and Dorica over who owns the true content, who owns that material that has been published. And these are debates that can be engaged in. But then there are issues of patents and whatnot. So this is protection and this is positive protection. It comes into play. So this is one concerned with preventing unauthorized use, and the other concerned with active exploitation of traditional knowledge and traditional cultural expressions by the originating community itself. Okay? So the second way in which protection can be expressed is through what is known as defensive protection. So defensive protection refers to a set of strategies to ensure that the third parties do not use illegitimately or unfounded intellectual property rights over traditional cultural expressions. So traditional knowledge, subject matter, and related genetic resources, as well as other such materials. So you can't have other people coming to patent materials that are yours. For instance, I'm aware, I think the phrase Hakuna Matata or something like that, it must be patented in the United States. And this is a phrase that is native to Swahili, Hakuna Matata. It means no worry, do not worry. And because it was used in a certain American movie, and it ended up becoming patented, and now it can't be used commercially anywhere, even though it's a native tribe, a native phrase in Swahili, you know. And so there are other such issues. This happens with many things, such as plants, such as waters, such as ideas. You can have a plant in Zambia, in Malawi, in Tanzania, that has certain potencies to heal and to cure and to do whatever. But the moment these plants are patented by outsiders, it becomes difficult for you to use them for the same purposes, because now you are breaking internationally recognized patencies. And so there must be a way to protect, and this is what is being termed here as defensive protection. So defensive protection of traditional knowledge excludes measures to preempt or to invalidate patents that illegitimately claim pre-existing traditional knowledge, okay, and also inventions. So they must be of things that we are familiar with. So on indigenous knowledge systems, okay, I think this is as far as we can go, and we can have further discussions involving indigenous issues on how emotive these issues are and how they're generally avoided within nations, as they denote issues of rights and privileges. I'm aware in Southern Africa currently there's an issue of indigenous land. Okay, there are certain communities that are claiming rights to indigenous land. To what extent can this be justifiable, that certain communities can be able to claim that because they inhabited a certain territory for so many years prior to now, then they are the rightful owners of that land? Okay, that debate ensues over time. There's also the debate that goes on over who controls land between the state and the traditional leadership, who owns it, and these are debates that exist, and also over resources and whatnot. So these are emotive debates. That's why I tried today, and I tried to make sure we try and just summarize the debate and not get into the intricacies of it. Okay, so in general, definitions that combine indigenous peoples and local communities have been preferred as it addresses the existing diversities among nationals and also among legislation. So there are differences that exist, and we differ over many of these things. And it's okay, and it's fine, as long as it does not breed significant or conflict to the extent of damage and things like that. We should be able to reason with each other when discussing issues of indigenous differences. So some countries do not accept the term indigenous but prefer local communities, okay, while others would rather insist on the term indigenous than using the term local communities. So you cannot have meaningful discourse on indigenous peoples and local communities without reference to natural resources and how these are governed and the benefits are distributed. Okay, so there are various forms of protection for both indigenous persons as well as local communities, as well as the natural resources within their communities. So I said that towards the end, which is now, we will then try and understand a certain case study of indigenous knowledge and local systems that have existed. Okay, so this document was written by Alfonso Peter Castro as well as Craig Ettinger. Okay, and it's an anthropological study. It tries to understand indigenous studies from an anthropological perspective. And I think this is the best way to approach it. Anthropology gives us a certain wealth in understanding concepts. And I think it's very important for us to, both as political scientists, international relations experts, sociologists, or whatever other school of thought you come from, to be able to relate from an anthropological perspective. It's very enlightening. So this paper that I'll share with you guys, those who are interested can hit me up in my inbox and I'll send it to you immediately. It was prepared by the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, as well as the Community Forestry Unit, for the Global Electronic Conference on Addressing Natural Resource Conflicts Through Community Forestry. Okay, this was in 1996. It's quite an old paper. I'm very sure if you skim through the internet and do your research and literature review, you'll realize that there are far much more modern documents that exist. There are many, and that can be much more useful to you as you try and study more deeply these concepts. However, This was a good paper. It was an extremely good paper. I've gone through this paper 2 or 3 times, and each and every time it brings out a certain wealth in it, and it was from a very informed background. So this paper analyzes the interface between indigenous knowledge and conflict management in community forestry. Indigenous knowledge is portrayed as a repertoire of ideas and actions from which community members faced with specific problems can draw, depending on their level of knowledge, their preferences, and their ability and motivation to act. Thus, it involves improvisation and flexibility in response to ongoing conditions. Okay, so dispute processing is similarly characterized as a repertoire of processes which communities and their members respond to dynamically and differentially. So this is just a summary of the paper. And lastly, also, the paper presents 4 case studies, okay, which you can also explore. And these case studies explore the role and the relevance of dispute processing for community forestry. So the first case is a historical study of conflicts between the Njukine forest in Kenya. Okay, it goes to Kenya and tries to understand the historical conflicts that have taken place there. Okay, it reviews the dynamic, embedded, and protracted nature of disputes, as well as the importance of power differences in their resolution. In indigenous conflict resolution, power differences matter a lot. The influence that a chief has, the influence that a headman has, the influence that a father has, the influence that a young man has, and a woman has, and a mother has, and whoever, an old-aged person has in the community court is very differing, and it is very impactful on the results of that conflict resolution effort. Okay, so dispute resolution through the articulation of pre-indigenous resource, or rather pre-indigenous resource management practice with governmental agencies in Quebec, as well as this is in Canada. This is the second study. Okay. The strengthening and modifying of the Taliman system in the wake of the James Bay and Northern Quebec Agreement is also highlighted. So environmental mediation in Indonesia as a joint forestry management in India are also compared to try and come up with a roundup analysis of environmental studies and what really goes on. So among the many issues, as we conclude, that you can look at when you're looking at local dispute resolution mechanisms is negotiation. Negotiation becomes a very important element of local dispute resolution mechanisms. You need to negotiate because there's no complete solution. You are fighting over things such as land, which is open land for grazing, and you're fighting over things such as a forest. Do you preserve it because the trees that are there are used as medicines, or do you cut them down because you intend on building a school in that territory? So negotiation becomes a very important element when you're doing local dispute resolution. Okay, as well as advantages and limitations of the negotiation. It's not open. It's not an open book. There are advantages and there are limitations. The things you can do and things you can't do by virtue of it being a negotiation. You must be able to compromise certain things because it's a negotiation. You must choose an arena. What area will you discuss on and where? It's very important, the location. Mediation also becomes very important. You need to have a mediator if it's possible. And there are certain roles and characteristics that mediators possess that you can look up to. So for instance, you need someone who is independent of the two parties that are in conflict. You need someone who's not politically aligned, for instance. And that's how come, in most cases, the church in religious countries, the church as well as imams for the Muslim communities have been very useful when it comes to conflict resolutions at the indigenous levels. Others have been traditional leaders. They're also very significant, very useful, because most of the times they do not have any benefit from the either losing or winning of either parties. That's why if you follow, there's that sitcom that often comes on DSTV. It's a Zambian sitcom. It's called Mwine Munshi. And Mwine Munshi is a folklore type of sitcom that is surrounded around the concept of a traditional leader that engages in regular dispute resolution over issues that are going on within his community. And there are various issues that come in, from pregnancies to misbehaviors in homes to fights to theft, corruption, political disagreements, many things that take place. And the chief is seen as an impartial, or the headman is seen as an impartial individual, because oftentimes he has nothing to benefit from and nothing to lose as well from either party's winning or losing. Okay, so a mediator then becomes a very important person. But the mediator should not make the decision on behalf of the two parties in conflict. This is very important. When you do engage in the concept of mediation, you realize the job of a mediator is just to listen to the views of the two and to allow them to expand their reasoning. His job is not to dictate to them what the solution would be. So this is important also for us to understand. Arbitration also comes in. We must engage. So I would advise you to read about what is arbitration, what is it, what does it mean? And that's where our lawyers come in, and our friends, who our learned colleagues, Audrey and them, who are very experienced in these areas, this counsel. They're able to arbitrate on behalf of two parties, to speak on your behalf. Okay? So adjudication as well as communities becomes important. There are things such as courts, and courts can exist in the contemporary way of it, the local court and the magistrate court, but they can also exist in the native and indigenous way, such as in Rwanda, as I gave the example earlier. You have a system known as gacaca. Gacaca became extremely relevant in Rwanda, in the post-genocide Rwanda, after it became clear that it was impossible for the contemporary courts to handle the magnanimity of the cases that had been presented before them. Okay? So there were great cases and significant cases. Papa, thank you so much for watching. I've been watching you there, you're around. Thank you so much for coming through. So there are a lot of cases that came up. People were killed by their neighbors and by their relatives and by in-laws and things like that. And someone had to be held accountable. But it became impossible, because of the process of Western courts, where you have to bring evidence, you have to find a lawyer, you have to what. Those processes hampered progress and timely adjudication of issues. And that country was just looking to heal. They just needed to heal. So how could they get through with this? They went back to their native concepts, to their indigenous systems, and they derived from their indigenous justice systems, a practice known as gacaca. Gacaca, which is a court system, it is a legal process, but it is at local level. It uses people it allows the victim as well as the perpetrator to both integrate in society. So it's not just about isolating you, but you should be able to pay for your crimes, of course, as well as also to be accommodated within the society in which you live. Okay? If your offenses are too grave that you have to be excommunicated, that is another issue. But oftentimes they try to get over, because they acknowledge tradition, African tradition in particular, acknowledges that human beings exist in a system of life whereby people take offense and can offend. And as such, the African traditional systems, that is, aim to ensure the continuity of society. Their aim is not to retribute completely. No. The aim is to ensure that when you are faced with the justice system in Africa, you should be given certain teachings that allow you to not propagate your practices again. Okay? You should not repeat the thing that you have done, but then again, you should not be hated by the community. The community should be able to heal and to move on and to agree on ways forward. So sometimes they will even loan you out. I know of a particular case in the local communities where some individual committed a murder, and he murdered a certain young man, a friend of his, during a drinking spree, and this issue was sorted out in a local community, and the solution of that court was that the individual would be, to some extent, loaned out to the family of the victim, to allow that the family of the victim would not suffer much loss from the loss of their breadwinner. And so this individual, therefore, starts to provide for the parents and the old-aged parents of the deceased. Okay? So in this case, he becomes their son. Okay? Yes, they've lost, but they've not lost completely. Okay? They've not lost completely, because in the absence of such a system, they would in fact lose completely. They would be faced with a system whereby they've lost their son, they've lost their income, and now they have no hope. And that is what, because the person who committed the offense is probably locked up for 30 or 20 years and has no opportunity to rectify the wrongs that he has done. So the court system of traditional African systems becomes significant to look at when we are looking at indigenous methods of conflict resolution. Okay. However, there are many barriers that are there, and there are many ways that we can interrogate them to try and understand how these barriers make it difficult for us to practice the indigenous methods of living. One issue has been government intervention in community practices and community interactions. And one of the case studies that this article I mentioned is in Indonesia and India, where they try and assess how then does government, the modern state, fit in to a traditional indigenous system, whether it's justice system, whether it's legal system, whether it's the practice of life. How does a modern government system that has modern courts and magistrates and that has enforcement officials such as lawyers and police officials and things like that, how does this fit in to a community where they are accustomed to using indigenous knowledge systems? So these are questions for research. For those of you that are interested in the areas of indigenous knowledge systems and indigenous conflict resolution, you can look at these issues. You can say, okay, then this is a question for you to say an analysis of the interactions between contemporary state justice systems and indigenous justice systems. Okay, so you can be able to analyze that, and there are many other questions that can be born out of that inquiry to say, what is the impact, therefore, on the modern state if people continuously try to sort out their problems through modern ways? How can they find other resolutions through the courts? Will it make the chiefs irrelevant if we are constantly solving our problems through the courts? Will it make the courts irrelevant if we are constantly solving our problems through the chiefs? We need to ask these questions. A question comes in, I think it's in Uganda, where a non-government organization is implementing a strategy of modernization and development in a certain community in eastern Uganda. And a certain gentleman loses 5 of his cattle and he goes to court. And the local communities, through the chiefs, petition right to the court to say, can you throw that case out? Because that is a local case and we want to deal with it at local level. So there are those interactions. Similarly, someone is murdered for witchcraft by the local community, and the courts say, no, that is a criminal offense. So it must be dealt with in the courts and not at local level. So there are those interactions that exist. We must, if we're going to carry out further research, check to say, how does indigenous knowledge systems, how do they come in conflict and how do they interact with modern justice systems? So that was my class for today, indigenous systems, knowledge systems and conflict resolutions, and trying to find out how the environment plays a big role. I must state this class towards the end has been sponsored by Major Philip Mubanga. Thank you so much, boss. He has been the sponsor of this class, and so thank you so much for coming through and for staying online throughout this class. I'm grateful for those of you that have come through. Remember to wash your hands, to observe social distance, to stay at home if you can. And tomorrow we'll continue with a different topic and we'll see how we can delve deeper. I hope I've given you a synopsis into understanding, starting from yesterday when we looked at the conflicts that exist, okay, in society as a result of the environment and natural resources. And then today, to understand now how natural resources and the environment exist in their own space, and how our role as human beings is to protect them. And apart from protecting them, how can we interact? How can the systems interact? If you want to understand more about this, there's what is known as institutional theory. So there's an institutional theory. How does it fit into these two systems that exist? There's traditional system, and then there's the modern system. There's the state system, and there's the indigenous system. How do they interact? Okay, so thank you so much for coming through. Tomorrow we continue with different topic. We'll be looking at something different, but within the same spectrum. We're still trying to blend in the philosophies. Okay, so as soon as we have that through, then we'll break down now to look at international relations on its own, to look at military studies on its own, to look at peace and conflict on its own, and things like that. So thank you so much for coming through, and may God bless you. Thank you.